Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation for ISAN 2025 conference. My name is Verstraaten-Bortier and I'll be presenting on the topic, A Trailing Spouse's Search for Significance in a Unifying Identity, a poetic autoethnography of identity formation and of thriving in hostile places. Overview of my presentation. I'd like to start by looking at why this project. Then I'll move on to definition and perceptions of the trailing spouse. I'll be sharing poetic depictions of who I am expected to be as a trailing spouse. The kept woman, the entertainer, be passive or be brought under control, the punch bag. I also look at my search for significance. 1. Do I matter to the locals? 2. Am I of any use to the company my husband works for or with? I'll be looking at making sense of it all by working with metaphors. I'll be using plant metaphors on how I thrive in hostile places. I'll conclude on the question of who I am as opposed to what others expect me to be. So why this project? I believe conflicts come about when what is expected is not what is received or perceived. Not much has been written on the expert spouse in conflict situations within their immediate community, either with the locals or with management. What's written so far about trailing spouses has to do with the individual struggle with their new location. Definition of trailing spouse. According to Allianz Care, the trailing spouse is sometimes known as the passive spouse and refers to a person who accompanies their spouse on an overseas work assignment. It really hurts to be referred to as a passive spouse. Struggles of the trailing spouse. The struggles of the trailing spouse are well documented and are popularly referred to as trailing spouse syndrome. Symptoms include feelings of isolation, lack of purpose or direction, loss of identity. One becomes nameless, really, most often reduced to just some manager's wife. The notion of the passive spouse is so solidified that anything else, for example, an assertive trailing spouse, becomes an abomination. With the trailing spouse being seen as a passive spouse, is it any wonder that all hell broke loose when one is anything but passive? What am I to do with all my drive, all my passion, all my compassion, and all my ambition? My positionality and privilege. As a trailing spouse of 25 years, we've worked and lived in 7 locations across 6 countries: Ghana, Seychelles, the Netherlands, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, Ghana again, and Liberia. In the last 3 countries, we've lived together with the locals on a plantation that's an agricultural estate. And it's mostly these 3 locations that I've come into contact with locals most and have had some conflicts. Some are very mild, negligible to very serious conflicts. So for instance, in Ivory Coast, I was perceived with slight suspicion at the beginning of our time there. This quickly changed to warm reception and being welcomed into the community. In Ghana, there were some mild hostilities which lasted for a few years. Afterwards, people warmed up to us and were welcome again. In Liberia, there were profound hostilities right from the get-go, resulting in a very unsettling and traumatizing experience like never before. So, this is how I think people perceive me through my interactions with them. So, depictions of who I am expected to be. 1. The kept woman. So, what do you do for a living? My newest friend, Emil, on my doctoral program asked. Well, I'm primarily a homemaker, I answered. Oh, you mean the polite way of saying you're a kept woman? She smiles with a twinkle in his eye. I laugh. Perhaps I shouldn't have, but it was just too funny not to. You see, a kept person, according to the online Cambridge Dictionary, is a person who does not work. Instead, is given money and a place to live by the person he or she is having a sexual relationship with. I believe this is a true representation of what quite a few people think is the enviable lot of the trailing spouse. According to medium.com, at Lyle contrasts what I call the promise and the practice of being a kept woman as follows. The promise, eternally pampered, placed on a pedestal, life is lived in a fabulously easy mood. The practice, an ambiguous cage that confines and holds progress, takes away independence, limits future options. The promise is not my life. However, the practice, if left unchecked and not counteracted, could easily have been my life as a trailing spouse. So yes, the trailing spouse does share some overlapping characteristics with the kept woman. Nonetheless, I'm no kept woman. Depictions 2. The entertainer. I'm expected by both the place of employment and the expert community to be good at entertaining, but much to their disappointment, I'm no matter. I'm more of a Mary, giving much time and attention to the exchange of ideas than to keeping busy in the kitchen. Fortunately for me, Jesus once affirmed Mary's disposition as valid. That grants me great validation, far beyond what others expect me to be as an expert wife. At one of our assignment locations, 2 Caucasian expert wives could no longer hide their irritation of me being constantly busy with academic work. They proclaimed, "Why stress and worry yourself so much with going to school at your age when your husband has a good job? Relax, enjoy life, come do yoga with us." Well, I would love to, but getting myself busy with academic work gives me so much pleasure than my well-meaning fellow expert wives may ever comprehend. Depictions 3. Be passive or be brought under control. All hell broke loose when I drove the company-assigned car on arriving in Ghana, my home country, as a trailing spouse. That marked my first introduction and initiation into the workings of the local community. Why did I do that? Well, we are a family of 6, but we were given a 5-person car with an assigned driver, which leaves only 4 passenger spaces for the 6 of us to share. My husband couldn't drive in Ghana yet, as his Ghanaian license was still being processed, and one cannot drive with a foreign license in Ghana. Without pausing to think of the dilemma we've been put in by being given a 5-person car plus an assigned driver, the tongues of the local community and the workers of the company went into overdrive, wagging about how the car was given to my husband and not to me. And with that one incident, I was branded a domineering wife, a usurper of authority, and a suppressor of men. Just about the same time, our assigned house was all overgrown, with no clear demarcation between the forest and us. We therefore requested for a clearing between our house and the forest. The process of getting the clearing in place led to me being accused of calling the managing director at the time a fool, when all I said to those doing the weeding was that weeding from the forest towards our house, like they were doing, would inevitably drive snakes towards our home. Instead, it made more sense starting weeding from our dwelling place towards the thick tropical forest. HR's advice was sought on how to deal with me on this matter. Not much, he said, since I was not directly employed by the company. My case was handed over to the security department for further investigation. I was neither interviewed nor did I see the outcome of the investigation. My husband, however, did receive a memo to put me under control. Depictions 4. The punch bag. The gardener, a grown man, went on air and accused me of beating him up so badly that his whole body aches and he can't walk properly. And yet, he was able to walk all the way to the radio station. He did not show up for work, and as was my habit, I sent to check if all was well with him. His wife claimed he had not seen him since the day before. I requested for my husband's car, this time with the driver and 2 other workers, and off we went looking for him. We eventually found him working on his rice field. He started walking away while we were still talking about why he didn't turn up for work, after I had already generously given him 2 days off to go attend to his rice farm the same week. Without recognizing fully that he was setting a trap for me, I reached out my hand to touch him on the arm while saying, "Why are you walking away when we are still talking?" A few weeks earlier, an expert had resigned, most likely not from his own free will, because a local had accused him of shaking his body so badly that he now has problems with his back. The local received a cool amount of money in US dollars as compensation for medical treatment. With my case, the workers' union incited the locals who threatened to go on strike and called for the removal of my husband, citing their own made-up law that crimes are transferable. This case drew the attention of 6 national newspapers and a TV station, all of whom descended on the same day in a clear, coordinated fashion. These developments happened whilst we were on leave. The ensuing story that went round was that as soon as I beat up the gardener, my husband took the whole family and we ran out of the country. Even though management acknowledged that they knew very well that the gardener was lying, he was still awarded a cool $500 compensation, with 0 demands whatsoever on him, not even to go back on air to retract his slanderous words. That tells me management's primary concern was to quell the threats of a strike action and not so much to clear my name. In fact, management's action, though well-meaning, implicated me even more. How else could anyone justify that amount of money and still believe that I barely even touched the guy? Never in all of my life's experience have I been so falsely accused on such public domain and on an almost nationwide scale. To say that experience was traumatizing would be a gross understatement. Other than finding myself in conflict-ridden situations, am I of any use to the locals? Why does your wife get involved with the locals? My husband's boss asked. She wants to be a useful member of the community, is the simple answer. As an expat wife, I do have certain privileges, but I'd rather use them to help the locals than stay within the expat bubble where I'm not of much use except for attending receptions. For those close to me, the locals that is, I'm able to use my privilege to help them continue their education through night school or even their children's education, get them into better housing units, and to gain easy access to healthcare. Some of those helpful to me have had job opportunities, possibly based on the honest recommendation letter I wrote for them. With favors to be had, not everyone who got close to me had done so from a good place. Boundaries are now in place, and those who've transgressed them have called me wicked. All in all, it is mutually satisfying when a local helps me understand and make my way safely through their wondrous ways of doing things, and I, in turn, can offer them any of the above helps when needed. Am I of any benefit to my husband's workplace? Sometimes I wonder that. A silent contributor to workplace well-being, perhaps. There's a Ghanaian saying which goes like this. When the wise man of the village couldn't solve a particular problem brought before him, he saw the wisdom of the old lady of the night, and much to their pleasant surprise, he got the solution to the problem the following morning. Who might this wise woman of the night be? Could she be the wife of the wise man with whom he conferred during the night? On a number of occasions, I've offered a different take on issues due to my understanding of West African cultural practices. That may have been helpful to the company my husband works for. Some of these exchange of ideas go beyond cultural issues. For instance, my training as a psychotherapist affords me the ability to contribute ideas behind the scenes that lead to the resolution or at least the minimization of conflicts at the workplace. But hey, who gives credit to the wise lady of the night when her very existence is hardly acknowledged? After all, she's simply a passive spouse. Making sense of it all by working with metaphors. Because we reason in metaphors, the metaphors we use determine a great deal about how we live our lives, writes Lakoff and Johnson 2023 in their book Metaphors We Live By. Effectively, the metaphors we use also show how we see ourselves. The second half of this project takes a deep dive into the metaphor of having shallow roots and how I live my life as a shallow-rooted trailing spouse. Thus, to be a successful trailing spouse is to learn to thrive and bloom in shallow soil. It's about temporality, non-permanence, of not putting down deep roots. It is to admit that only shallow roots are allowed here, and yet I'm going to be of good use to my community. I have this idea of, even though I'm shallow rooted and I'm a shallow rooted person because of my being an expert wife, I have this visuals of plants that are also shallow rooted, yet they bloom beautifully, they add value to wherever they are located. And to the left is the sprawling sedum, they are succulents. And to the right is thyme, it's called creeping thyme. And they're just joyful, even though they are very shallow rooted. Thriving in hostile places. The metaphors I live by, sprawling sedums and trailing thymes, or thriving between the cracks. The very nature of the expat life means that one can only put down shallow roots. To be successful, therefore, one has no choice but to learn to thrive in shallow soil. Shallow-rooted plants are vulnerable to wilting in the heat of the sun, dying off completely in the dry seasons, of being uprooted and tossed about by strong winds, or dying when the shallow roots rot in the excess moisture of the rainy seasons. Life is tough for the shallow-rooted, and yet the hardy ones have learned to thrive on little soil with little moisture and an abundance of sunlight, shooting out some of the most beautiful ground-covering blooms. Sedum, a soft yet strong succulent, also called stonecap. Sedums are shallow-rooted succulents. As per succulentalley.com, sedums are content to be space fillers, never invasive, always adding a pop of color and texture to the landscape. Much like the successful trailing spouse, sedums are free-spirited with sprawling stems, taking up space only where there is room, and there will always be room because we can thrive even between the cracks in concrete surfaces, and even bloom in hard places where others may fail. Sedums and the shallow-rooted creeping thyme survive in challenging conditions of small quantity of soil that's low in nutrients. They fill hard places with greenery, flowers, and the occasional pleasant fragrance. They are beneficial to other plants around them, in that they attract useful insects, which aid in pollination and enhancing the fruitfulness of all around them. Thus, the trailing spouse, much like these hardy trailing plants, ought to be cherished and celebrated, not villainized, for all the wealth and warmth she brings to her immediate community. Rather than sending deep roots downwards, trailing thymes and sprawling sedums find fulfillment in spreading their shallow roots sideways, thereby growing and blooming in an outward trail. And just like these happy sedums and thymes, I may not be able to put down deep roots in any one location, but in spreading outward, I too have found nourishing communities further afield, like this International Autoethnography community, IANI, like my International Poetic Inquiry community, ISPI, as well as guest lecturing opportunities in Cameroon, Ghana, and Liberia. Actively participating in these academic associations have blessed me with a great sense of community, a sense of achievement, fulfillment, and satisfaction. On the question of who I am, the final set of 3 poems are my reflections on the above question. The first poem addresses the issue of my sense of self within the context of being a trailing spouse. The second poem takes a look at who I am, if not what others expect me to be. My sense of self. After all the troubles I've been through, I've drawn a line in the sand, and with that I say enough is enough. I've regained my sense of self as a helpful member of the community to those who welcome me, an assertive member of the community who is not afraid to stand her grounds and to call out behaviors of the powerful that are harmful to the community. I believe my message is now clear. I may be a trailing spouse, alright, yet I'm anything but passive. I may have shallow roots, alright, yet I'm not going to be trashed around or bashed about by anyone, and I'm definitely not going to cower to any upward or downward bullying for that matter. Perhaps the assertive trailing spouse is an anomaly. If so, then so be it. The assertive trailing spouse, with all her shallow rootedness, is here to stay and thrive for as little or for as long as it takes. Who am I, if not? Who am I, if not the kept woman, the entertainer of others, the passive entity to be controlled, or the punch bag? They tried, didn't they? I'm nobody's muse. I'm no pushover. Rather, I push back and I call them out on their mistreatment of the foreigner. The trailing spouse. Trailing spouse, a term many find derogatory, an indication of a life without responsibility, direction, or meaningful activity, much like the kept woman. Well educated but without employment to put her talents to good use, she finds herself stuck. She's enjoyed having time with her children, filled her days with homeschooling, gardening, and library visits, but felt socially deprived. Eventually, she decides to make a life for herself, gains yet another university degree, starts attending and presenting at various conferences, which opens up her world. Since finding a new purpose in life, taking initiatives, and feeling engaged, she feels herself an equal again. The expert community looks at her with admiration. Now she is somebody with her own identity. Conversations circle around what she's currently working on and where next her research presentations might take her. Oh, how nice that feels. She's her own person now, no longer just a trailing spouse. Her business card says it's best: an independent researcher or scholar, a psychotherapist, a visiting lecturer, and a homeschooling mom. Not only is she trailing her husband on his career journeys, she's also leaving her own trail of academic pursuits around the world. She's become both a trailing spouse and very much her own trailerhead. This poem, The Trailing Spouse, started as a found poem from alliancecare.com, and I eventually wrote myself into it. In conclusion, in the end, I'm still asking, who am I? Am I who people say I am? The kept woman, the entertainer, one to be brought under control, or the punch bag? Or the wise old woman of the night, the helper of a few select locals? And even then, do I become the wicked woman when boundaries are enforced? I'm assertive. I'm not afraid to push back. I'm not a punch bag. Plus, I'm anything but passive. It's about time we redefined the expert spouse. A successful trailing spouse is one who has learned to thrive in shallow soil, even between the cracks, like this. Thank you very much.